千里之行，始于足下。A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Tao to travel the journey together. Welcome to Tao Talks with Derek Lin, where we take a deep dive into the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. As always, I want to extend my welcome to you. Thank you for joining us. I would like to invite you to center your thoughts and direct your attention to this moment in time, to the here and now, to be fully present and mindfully aware as we are ready ourselves for this sacred process in the Tao with one another. Let's get back to Tao Te Ching chapter 2. As we talked about last time, the chapter title is Observe the Manifestations. Observe is Guan, the Tao concept about detached observations. It is the keystone, it is the root of learning, to be able to observe everything from a detached frame of mind. Manifestations is what we can see in the physical universe. So yeah, I think everyone remembers that Tao Te Ching chapter 1 was observe the essence. So that was about the Tao. In this chapter, we progress logically from there to the functioning of the Tao in the material world. Hence, manifestations. And the chapter is 17 lines long, as you can see here. It depends on where you break the lines in the translation. That number can vary. We break it up this way, and then we divide it up into 4 sections, as you can see. So we have 2 lines in the first section. We have a longer second section, going into a transitional third section, and finally the concluding 4th section. How do we arrive at this division? Well, last time we went through an analysis. As usual, we identify the characters that are recurring from one line to the next. The characters that repeat, they indicate a poetic construction. Then those characters that are repeating should result in repeating translations on the right-hand side. And that's the reason why both the Chinese characters and the corresponding English words have been highlighted in red, so you can see that for yourself. So we don't need to go through this again. All the details have been recorded in the previous recording. We can continue with our recap. We only had an opportunity to go through the first line. And it's an important line. It's talking about Mei, which means beauty or beautiful. As an adjective, it's beautiful. As a noun, it's beauty. Whether it is used as an adjective or a noun, depending on the context in the typical Mandarin sentence. So we started out talking about this line that says, when the world knows beauty as beauty, ugliness arises. This is talking about the relative nature of the world and how complementary dualities are compared against one another in order for us to perceive them in their states of opposite comparisons. Now, my remark last time was that when it comes to beauty, there's definitely the external physical beauty, and then there's also the internal, the more intangible beauty of the mind and spirit. That is not so obvious as an external appearance, but is something that we do perceive in other people from time to time. My remark was that the world tended toward the physical. External physical beauty is a big deal in our world. Not a big surprise because we're all physical beings. We have to recognize that as a fact. But then the big emphasis on the physical will tend toward the superficial judgment that someone possessing physical beauty must be, in some sense, better than someone who doesn't have as much. In order to balance it out a little bit, the emphasis of the Tao is on the internal rather than the external. So we want to pay more attention to character, to integrity, to virtues, as opposed to how good looking someone may be. And that is why we have this here. It's talking about the internal and external, different kinds of beauty, but also, more importantly, it links the first line of this chapter to concepts that we went through in chapter 1, the previous chapter. So the middle two quotes, constantly with desire, one observes its manifestations. Constantly without desire, one observes its essence. This is from the previous chapter, chapter 1. I bring them in because they happen to match perfectly this theme of internal versus external beauty. And at the bottom, you see yet another quote from the previous chapter that these two emerge together but differ in name. So this led us into a discussion about how we often say, don't judge a book by its cover, that people judge one another based on the first impression of looks, if we're honest about it with ourselves. As style cultivators, with this understanding, we should seek to contemplate and possibly transcend. That the assessment that we have of others should be more from a detached, desireless state. That allows you to look through the superficial level so you can take the internal essence into consideration. It is entirely possible for someone to look good externally and also possess internal beauty. We just have to recognize that it may not always be the case as we interact with different people, as we meet new people and get to know them. Always a good idea to suspend judgment until we really get to know someone. Conversely, knowing this dynamic means that as style cultivators, we should understand the importance of taking proper care of appearance. It's all about being presentable to the world. It's all about an external manifestation that reflects your internal essence. That is to say, your sense of self-respect, your confidence about yourself. You respect others as well by being presentable. Therefore, the internal state of mind can affect the external appearance. And we also talked about how when we advance in the Tao, when we become more refined internally, that spiritual advancement can be reflected in the mental side of the brain. That is to say, it can lead us into thinking in different ways about ourselves and our relationships with other people. It can motivate us to further improve ourselves with perhaps exercise, proper nutrition, self-care, wellness, etc. Definitely, the internal changes that we make can radiate outward to the external, thus affecting our relationships with the people we come into contact with every day. We got pretty deep into that discussion about physical beauty versus spiritual beauty. We talked about the difference. We talked about how the impact of physical beauty upon our world is pretty big. It does have a perceptible effect on people everywhere. We have entire industries that are built upon it to help people maintain youth and beauty, or to help people enhance what they naturally possess. The other hallmark of physical beauty is that it does fade with age. That's just the reality. So we try to hang on to it, but sooner or later, time extracts its toll on all of us, on anyone. Now, on the other side of the equation, spiritual beauty can be quite different. It isn't so much a first impression kind of thing like physical beauty, but it may be something that becomes more obvious as you get to know a person in the course of time. It can be enhanced by age. And my suggestion last time was to look for the spiritual beauty. You can see that beauty in the soul. And what I meant is looking through the windows of the soul, which is the eyes. Looking into someone's eyes, I believe that we can all perceive that beauty. It's a beauty that can be cultivated. We can practice virtues. It has a beautifying effect. We can require ourselves to be consistent. What I mean by that, consistency in words and actions. We don't say one thing but do another. To be consistent as well with different kinds of people, that we treat them equally, that we play no favorites. That consistency can be very attractive. It's all about acting from the Tao, that if you follow Tao principles and let that dictate everything that you say and do, that is the beginning of your manifestation of internal beauty. And once you're able to do that consistently, eye contact becomes a great way for you to express naturally that internal beauty that exists within. So that's where we ended up last time, just with one line from this chapter of the Tao Te Ching. It led us into a pretty extensive discussion, as you can see. Now we're ready to explore line 2. Let's go ahead and do that. Line 2 says, when it knows good as good, evil arises. This is basically saying when the world knows good as good, evil arises. This is also about the relative nature of the world, that things need to be compared against one another. Before we get to the meaning, before we dive deeply into the meaning, let me single out the key character that you see, which is 善. So pinyin, relatively easy there. The meaning is good, kind, goodness, kindness. Again, it depends on whether it is being used as an adjective or a noun, and that can shift contextually. Now, comparing the second line with the first line. The first line has the word 天下 as the first two characters. If you subtract out those two characters, then what follows has a character by character match with the second line. That is a poetic construction, and in that construction, the possession of 善, goodness, kindness, is in the same position as 美, beauty, beautiful. And it's similar with what follows, 不善. The first character there, 不, it just means no. So if 善 is good or kind, then 不善 would be literally no good or unkind. So that's the meaning. Not good, unkind, malicious, malice. Malice would be the opposite of kindness. To be malicious would be the opposite of being good. And again, in the poetic construction, it is in the same position as 恶, which is the ugliness from the previous line, except that this is two characters versus the one character in line 1. Now, I want to pivot off the poetic match positionally to say that if we're relating beauty to good, then I should also point out that there is a spiritual kind of beauty in being good and having kindness in the heart. So it is proper for there to be a match poetically. Conversely, there is ugliness in being malicious and unkind. I think you and I have experienced that kind of ugliness from time to time in our lives. Someone being cruel, that is not a beautiful sight. And then lastly, I want to put the emphasis on the comparison. The first line is about comparing the beautiful with the ugly, whether physical or spiritual. The second line, comparing the good with the bad. And it's a good point that is made by Lao Tzu that unless you know what is good, what is better, you may not realize that something is bad. And I definitely can share an experience that I know when I was a little boy going to elementary school, I spent almost 4 hours every day going to and from school. In the morning, I took a crowded public bus that took me halfway to the school. And then I transferred to the school bus for the rest of the way. So the trip took a little bit less than 2 hours. Coming back home, it was the opposite. School bus first, and then the public bus. Now, I did that for years and never realized it was a hardship. And that was because I had nothing to compare against. It was only much, much later on, with more varied experiences in life, when my situation changed, that I realized, hey, it actually wasn't that easy when I was little. So from personal experience, I can definitely see the truth in what Lao Tzu was bringing up. Next slide. So looking at the line as a whole, when it knows good as good, evil arises. It here is referencing the world. Now I want to talk about knowing as an idea in both the Western paradigm and the Eastern paradigm. Knowing in terms of knowledge. Today, in our world, I think there's a very easy tendency for us to see knowledge as a good thing. We say knowledge is power, and we have seen that this is very true throughout human history. Those who have the knowledge, those who have better technology, are the ones with the edge, with the advantage. Definitely true when we especially see historically the clash of civilizations. Now, even though knowledge appears to be overwhelmingly positive today, I just want to point out that it hasn't always been seen in a positive light, like 100% positive light. In the Western paradigm, we have this idea, this underlying idea that when Adam and Eve consumed the forbidden fruit, they gained knowledge, the knowledge of good and evil, because the fruit that they ate came from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So from that point on, they knew what was good and bad. They knew shame. Before that, they had a state of ignorant bliss and innocence. One can see that as a metaphor for an innocent child growing up, gaining knowledge, knowing the difference between good and bad, which goes to a pretty good match of what we're talking about in this chapter. In the biblical account, that is metaphorical origin about humanity, that knowledge, gaining the knowledge, was also the cause of the fall from grace for Adam and Eve. And then mortality set in. So this is really today not seen as a warning against knowledge, but as a biblical story, sort of for its own sake. It is not the only take in Western culture about knowledge. I would also remind everyone the myth of Prometheus, the god who brought fire to mankind, the god that taught mankind how to use fire, thus elevating mankind from ignorance to a state that was a lot closer to the gods, to the power of the gods. For this offense, for this crime, Prometheus was punished for eternity. So there you see yet another angle on how knowledge is not a good thing, at least for the bringer of knowledge. Whereas for humanity that benefited from fire, knowledge was a very good thing. So that is a very quick survey of Western paradigm. It's good and bad. Our attitude toward knowledge is that sometimes we say there are certain things that man was not meant to know. Sometimes we have movies where you see people suffering horrible fates, like, quote unquote, he knew too much. So it's not always positive, and yet we also enjoy advanced technology, which is all about knowledge. What about Eastern paradigm? What about the Tao that we study? Well, in this chapter, what Lao Tzu is saying that knowledge is necessary to make sense of the world. We need to know goodness in order to follow the right path. to distinguish between good and bad, to make judgment calls. Laozi further points out we need to understand evil in order to know what to avoid. In the journey of life, there are plenty of possibilities for pitfalls. Things that if we know enough, we will try to avoid whenever possible. And generally speaking, we just need comparison and contrast to tell the difference between the two. What is good? What is bad? Now, I also need to point out here that the study of the Tao is the study of nature. When we talk about nature, we're not excluding human nature. The study of the Tao is also about the study of human nature, and you and I know human nature is a complex mixture of the good and bad, the beautiful and not so beautiful. There are definitely parts of nature, of our nature, that is not pleasant to look at. And one of the manifestations of human nature is that we will oftentimes come up with justifications to try to turn something that is not so good into something that seems to be good. Something that may be quite ugly, but we try to turn it into something that's more pleasant to consider. For instance, think about the person who says, well, I was just being critical and discouraging only because I wanted to prevent him from becoming arrogant. So the criticism, the discouragement might seem quite harsh, might not appear so beautiful, but the justification there is that while you see my intentions are good, I want to keep him from becoming arrogant, I want to keep him humble. I have a good purpose. There's goodness in my heart, therefore beautiful. That's one way to justify our actions. And you see this all the time, manifesting in different ways. You might hear people say, well, I was late turning in my work only because I wanted to double check everything and make sure that it was done right. I'd rather be careful than wrong. So being late, not meeting a deadline might be seen as a bad thing, but then human nature is such that we try to turn it into something favorable to us, favorable to the ego. I wanted to double check because I'm very cautious and this is all for the good. Human nature. Next slide. So now let's take a look at line 3. Line 3 says, thus, being and non-being produce each other. Let's talk about the first character there, gu. The pinyin is pretty simple there, and the meaning is also fairly simple. Therefore, thus, so. Those are the different ways that we can say gu in English. Now, let's take a look at the rest of the line. Basically says, being and non-being produce each other. Let's talk about what that means first. The being part, the first character, you, it means that which exists, that which has existence, that which is there, that which is around, that we can perceive. The second character, wu, non-being, means not having existence, non-existence, nothingness. So this sets up the complementary duality of being and non-being, which just means existence versus non-existence. Somethingness versus nothingness. Next, let's continue talking about the meaning of this line. What is it saying? It is saying that which exists can be destroyed, thus producing nothingness. That is, the thing that existed before no longer exists. Therefore, it went from being to non-being. Then, the flip side. Nothingness produces existence. Something coming from nothing. For instance, we know just by looking around that there's plenty of life in this world. We ourselves are alive, or so we like to think. We look at the world, we see all kinds of living things. And yet, from science, we know that billions of years back in time, there was not the life that we see today. Indeed, there was a time, billions of years ago, when there was no life on this planet, period. So somehow, non-life, being barren, devoid of life, somehow life arose. Abiogenesis. Life came from non-life. The organic came from the inorganic. I think not perfectly understood, but we know that's definitely what happened long ago. We don't even have to look back that far to see how nothingness can produce somethingness or existence. Non-existence can produce existence. My second example is idea to invention. So many of the things that we see all around us today were invented by someone at some point. Somebody came up with an idea, turned that idea into reality. Now we have an object that we can see and touch and feel. So how did that work? Intangible idea manifesting as a tangible object in reality. What's even more is, where was the idea before it was conceived? It existed as potentiality in the mind of the inventor. Where was that potentiality before the inventor was born? The inventor, prior to being conceived, existed only as a potential to be conceived. Where was the idea for the invention then? What is the potential of a potential? And we can go further back in time until there was no life on this planet, but only the potential for life. Then we're talking about the potential of a potential of a potential of a potential, etc. Pretty much, we have to conclude this concrete object, this object that we can hold, used to be nothing. Then, in the world of the scientists, of the physicists, they speak of vacuum energy fluctuation. That is, at the subatomic quantum level, particles appear spontaneously. Energy fluctuations are converted into particles of matter, sometimes only for a fleeting second. And this is happening all the time, all around us. We cannot perceive it because we're not equipped to be able to perceive at the quantum level, but through science, we know it is happening all the time. Quantum mechanics are among the most practical, most applied, and the most well-tested of the physical sciences. Now, of course, I would have to admit that ancient sages knew nothing about any of that. They knew absolutely nothing about particle physics. But the previous two bullets about life and ideas and inventions, they could definitely observe that, and they could conclude the same, that everything came out of nothingness. And allow me to illustrate this idea in a more graphical way. Being and non-being. Let's talk about production process in general using a specific example. In this image, you see the woods. You see the trees in the forest. In front of the trees, you see timber. You see that quite a few of the trees have been cut down. Therefore, the trees have gone from being trees to no longer being trees. Not trees anymore. They cannot continue on being trees. They've been cut down, and therefore they transitioned from being to non-being. The timber did not exist before when they were just trees, so they went from non-being to now being timber. They're going to go from being timber to non-being as well. How so? Well, we know that the timber will be processed, cleaned up, cut, shaped into wooden blocks, wooden planks, into pieces of wooden boards. So at that point, the material for construction has come into being, but the timber no longer exists as just raw, unprocessed timber. So the wooden boards transitioned from not existing to now existing. They're there. You can see them, you can touch them, you can work with them, you can use them to shape something. And when you use them, they stop at some point being wooden boards. They being shaped into something else. Furniture is definitely a possibility. House, boat, all possibilities. I'll use chairs, wooden chairs, for our example here. That furniture has gone from not existing before to now existing. So as the trees no longer exist, now the chairs exist. Trees are now non-being. The chairs are now being. They transitioned from one to the other. Now, we can all understand this process, and I think the important point is to realize that similar processes are going on to everything all around us. This is probably the simplest one to understand, but it's basically the same thing everywhere. Furthermore, what we're looking at here, it can be further extended in both directions, past and future. If we think about the past of a tree, there was a point in time when the tree existed as a seed, not as a tree, a full-grown tree, but just as a seed, which is the potential for a tree. When the seed sprouted and became, in time, a tree, the seed went from being to non-being. It no longer existed as a seed. And when it was a seed, the tree did not exist as a tree, but after growth, the tree came into being from non-being. So that's how easily we can extend it back in time. And we can also extend far into the future. What if the furniture is burnt up in a fire? What if in the course of time, it breaks down and is discarded? It can be destroyed in some fashion. Therefore, the furniture can go from being to non-being. Line 4, it says difficult and easy bring about each other. Now, I want to talk about the transition using an example from life about something becoming easy when it used to be difficult. So the transition is starting out with difficulty, ending up with ease. For instance, when we start out learning a new skill, it's difficult. This applies to all the skills we learn throughout life, because when we start, it is unfamiliar, and that's why it is difficult. As time goes on, we continue to practice this new skill, so with time and effort, the difficult becomes easy. We have all experienced this transition from difficult to easy. The difficulty becomes routine, maybe even second nature. You don't have to think about it anymore. You just get it done. It doesn't seem like such a big deal. Of course, the easy life never lasts. We know that from experience too. So let's talk about the other way. Something that was easy becoming difficult. The transition from ease to difficulty. This is because change happens. At some point, you may advance to the next level. And when you make that advancement, you have to learn a new set of skills. Therefore, the easy, what used to be effortless, you master that skill because now it's a new set of skills, building perhaps on the old set of skills. Now it is difficult again. Your learning continues. This is something that can happen to anything that you do on a routine basis. Perhaps it is a new assignment at work or school. Perhaps it is a new system that has been upgraded. Now you have to learn the new way of doing things, the new way of navigating through the screens, the controls of the new system. Perhaps there's new, better procedures that you have to follow. So what used to be easy and comfortable is once again unfamiliar and uncomfortable. So the whole process comes full circle. Now we want to always keep in mind that with whatever Lao Tzu talks about, we apply this complementary duality to Tao cultivation. Think for just a moment about the journey of 1,000 miles. It's a long journey. It requires sustained effort. So naturally, we can legitimately see it as difficult. At the same time, we can all agree that every step in this journey is easy by itself. Taking one step requires no great effort at all, most of the time. Then we make the realization that the long journey, difficult, is made up of steps, easy. Thus, the difficult and easy bring about each other. Now, at any given moment on this journey, are things difficult or easy? I think you would agree that, well, it depends. Like, what is your day like so far? How are you doing? How's everything going for you? All good? We say that to one another often, and we hear people respond in different ways, including ourselves. What happens when people are having a tough time? We hear things like, oh, listen, I'm going through a rough patch. People may say, I'm dealing with some challenges right now. People talk about the tough times. People sometimes will joke about how, when the going gets tough, the tough something, like when the going gets tough, the tough go shopping, etc. So life does get tough sometimes. And I remember in our previous meeting, I talked about life being the school of hard knocks. So I'm no stranger to that idea. I hear people joke around and say, well, listen, life is a B and then you die. So there's definitely that whole idea about life being difficult. We do hear the opposite as well. We hear people occasionally say life is good. Or they may say, yeah, I'm having a good time. Or they may say, I love my life. Now, it could be the same person who was just talking about dealing with challenges a few days ago and is now having a good time because of the transitions back and forth. But because life does provide us with difficult challenges from time to time, it is something that we talk about, something that we even focus on in Tao cultivation. And I knew that there's a lot more to this topic than this one slide that you see in front of you. I actually addressed the overall topic of difficulty versus ease in one of my books. Well, in pretty much all my books, but in this particular book, The Tao of Joy, it was actually discussed in a very extensive way. And I try to bring out all the different aspects of Tao-oriented discussion on difficulty and ease. Life. Is it difficult? Is it easy? When is it difficult? When is it easy? Day 14 from the Tao of Joy, for instance, is talking about having a bad day. We've all been there. We see other people having a bad day and sometimes ourselves. And we know that sometimes when you're having a bad day, it's affecting you so much you can't pick yourself up. You need to get going, but you can't summon up enough energy. You may think, well, what's the point? Day 14 is meant to address that. It is using this very chapter we're discussing, this very line that we're discussing. Day 14 says, well, difficulty and ease is a matter of comparison. If something is difficult, it is only being compared to something that is easier. So how bad is your bad day in comparison to something worse? That comparison is the key. If you say you're having a bad day, it's being compared to a day that is not quite so bad. But then the question is this, look at it the other way. Have you had a day that's even worse? Chances are, for most of us, we can say yes. Although I'm having a bad day today, I had an even worse day some time ago. In comparison to that, the bad day today is actually not as bad. Then, as a Tao cultivator should, we zoom out our perspective to reflect upon the fact that right now, all over the world, there are pockets of human misery that are so incredibly severe and inconceivable. Because there's famine, drought, disease, warfare, and so on. Man-made and natural disasters. Compared to that kind of bad day, my bad day ain't so bad. And it gives me a reason to pick myself up and get going. So for the details, how bad is the bad day? I would advise you to take a look at that page, only one single page from the Tao of Joy. Other aspects of difficulty and ease, day 20 starts small. And that is because Lao Tzu talks about this. Lao Tzu says, if you've got something that's difficult, you can handle it through the stuff that is easy. With anything that is hard, you can always break it up into smaller subtasks. Some of them are going to be very easy to accomplish. As you get those out of the way, you gather up energy and confidence. You feel better and better about your prospects of completing something difficult. That is sound, practical advice from Lao Tzu, and I knew that I had to share it with everybody. That's day 20. And just one more, acceptance. Day 26 is about achieve a difficult feat today. And that's my challenge to you as well. Achieve a difficult feat today, right now, by accepting everything exactly as it is. Now, if you're hearing this for the first time, you may say, well, Derek, that's not difficult. That's easy. I'll accept everything right now. I know it doesn't sound like a difficult feat. I say that it is in that particular page only because there are so many people that you see every day who rail against the way things are. They complain because they want things to be different. And the complaints could be about all kinds of different things. Perhaps they regret having done one thing or another, or they feel resentment for something that was done to them. Either way, they're expending a lot of energy on the past. And I'm just pointing out, there's nothing we can do to change the past. In order to proceed full of energy in accordance with the Tao, we want to accept everything as it is, and then create, produce, work on improvements from that standpoint. So those are just 3 of the many examples from the Tao of Joy that touch on this concept of the difficult versus the easy. I use these concepts in my day-to-day, daily living all the time. When I'm encountering a challenge from life experience, I know that there's a big part of it that is actually based in the mind. That is, I think of something as difficult, it's difficult. I challenge myself, can I see something, that same thing, the same task, as easy? How can I see it as easy? When I bring up that question, my mind has an answer. Oh, it can be easy if I do X, Y, Z. It can be easy if I take a different approach. Then that is what I apply in my life to live life like the sages with effortless ease. Let's continue. Line 5, long and short reveal each other. This one I think is quite obvious. Something can only be long if someone else is short, and vice versa. If you have just one thing with no comparison to anything else, it cannot be rated as long or short because there's no comparison. And examples that are drawn from everyday living with clothing, you can have long sleeves versus short sleeves. When you have one versus the other, you can say one has longer sleeves than the other has shorter sleeves, etc. Not just clothing, but activities. You can take a long walk or a short stroll. Now, the long walk is only long if it takes more time than the short stroll. There's no absolute standard. So a walk that took half an hour may seem a lot longer than a 5-minute stroll. But then that half-hour walk is pretty short compared to a hike that lasted many hours. So the idea is that everything has to be compared and everything can be one or the other at the same time. What may seem long in one instance, like waiting in line at the ATM, can be quite short compared to something else, like fighting traffic for hours and hours on end. Same thing, when we interact with one another, we can be having a long talk or a short chat. Well, those are in comparison with one another. A talk that seems rather long can be dwarfed in duration from an even longer talk. Therefore, long and short are relative to one another and they change with different comparisons. Tao cultivators understand the same length or duration can be both long and short. It just depends. And the next one is similar because it is quantifiable measurements. All quantifiable measurements are relative. So this includes high and low, just like long and short. The height, the altitude, levels, stories, anything that is in terms of vertical dimension, that's what gives us the distinction of high versus low. And indeed, a person can be both high or low, depending on how you compare the position of that person. The height of that person can be tall or short. And again, depending on the comparison. When you stand next to a small child, you're tall by comparison. When you stand next to a professional basketball player, you may be short instead. Now, you haven't changed. You remain constant. The description of you will change because of what's next to you. In terms of size, compared to an ant, I feel like a giant, but then there are plenty of things much bigger than I am. So this is the basic insight. It applies to all measurements, heavy and light, hot and cold, many and few, large, small, and so on. Tao cultivators utilize this basic idea intelligently in a way that can benefit them. So I want to kind of zoom in on this. Comparisons in life. This is in reference to what I just mentioned about someone being high, someone being low in terms of their positions in life. Possibly their position, as an example, in the corporate ladder. Someone can be higher up, someone can be lower down. And I want to share a saying with you in Mandarin that talks about this life situation. The saying is, 比上不足，比下有余. What does that mean? Let me share the translation with you. It's in two parts. The first part says, compare above, not enough. The second part says, compare below, have excess. You can recognize that this is a very similar idea to what we have just talked about. It's just a matter of comparison. If I compare to someone above me, I don't have as much. Let's talk about the meaning. Compared to those who possess a lot, I just don't have quite as much. But then compared to those who possess little, I possess more than enough. I mentioned that Tao cultivators utilize this particular idea from the Tao for their own benefit. So how would that work? And how does it compare to the way that other people look at the world? So here is Tao cultivators. Other people may react in a way that is opposed to the Tao. And when I talk about comparisons, I am applying this to multiple areas of life. It could be wealth, it could be talent, it could be power. So the comparisons can be made compared to someone who's more wealthy. I'm not wealthy enough. Compared to someone who has a lot of talent, I don't have as much. Compared to someone who is very powerful, I'm not as powerful. And it is the same the other way too. Now, when people see those who have more, oftentimes we see them becoming jealous and act out of envy. If they study the Tao and take the Tao lessons to heart, they would not be reacting in quite that way. And it's the same in the other direction. When a lot of people see those who have less, they become arrogant and they feel superior. They place themselves higher in their minds. Now, I think the Tao would advise us to behave in a way that is not like those people I just described. For the Tao cultivators, it can be rather different. That is, I look at those above me and I feel humble. It is the reason why I can easily resolve any incipient potential feelings of arrogance. I just have to remember that there are other people who have more than I do, who are more talented than I am, who possess more knowledge than I do, or perhaps more power than I possess. I have good reasons to feel humble. Hence, it strengthens my practice of humility. Then, Tao cultivators can also look in the other direction, those who have less. Rather than to feel arrogant, like, look at me, I am better, I am superior. Rather than that, Tao cultivators would skillfully use the same thing, same comparison, same facts, to instead feel content and grateful, like there but for the grace of God go I. They are less fortunate, I should help them. The Tao remains constant. You haven't changed in who you are, in what you possess. But it is the perspective that you choose for yourself to make a whole world of difference. So remember the saying, compare above, compare below. To have not enough can make you humble rather than jealous. To have more can make you grateful rather than arrogant. That is the skill. Continue on to chapter 7. Music and voice harmonize each other. So that is also drawing from life, from everyday experience. This is different from the measurements. This is not about bigger, smaller, heavier, lighter, etc. This is other aspects of life that, although not necessarily quantifiable, they are still valid in comparisons. They can be complementing one another. So when we talk about this section, we often say comparisons and complements. Comparisons are about the quantities that we have just gone through, and complements are qualitative aspects of life, like what we're talking about now. Music and voice bring out each other's special qualities. There's no replacing the human voice with musical instruments. So you can have instrumental music, but in a song, the right voice adds something special to it. In a similar way, the human voice cannot replace the musical instruments. Now we have skillful vocalists who sing a cappella, and they can do a great rendition of a song without any accompanying instruments. But still, when we have all of those elements together, musical instruments and the human voice, we create something special. So in entertainment, we see a mixture of both, and we see different proportions. When we watch movies or perhaps a show on television, we can hear music, which is the soundtrack, and we hear dialogue, which is the voice. So this is where they come together for dramatic effect because they're complements. They complement each other to create this drama for us. A concert will be different. It could be all music like an orchestra, or it could be maybe a rock concert where you have the musical instruments and you have the vocalist. Of course, there are other possibilities as well. Halfway between movies and concerts, we have musicals. Musicals are like movies in that there's a plot, there's drama being presented, but then halfway through, partway through, the characters break into song and dance. So different forms of entertainment have different mixtures, all utilize the complementary beauty and goodness of music and voice for best effect. Line 8, front and back follow each other. Let's talk about the meaning of that. When I say front and back, one thing that can come to mind is perhaps ahead and behind. And it's very true that in society, the competitive nature of human beings can make it seem like a rat race. Everybody is racing against everybody else. We get ahead or we fall behind in the rat race. People seem very attached to getting ahead, and people become fearful of falling behind. This can be a source of stress and tension. People get stressed out trying to get past other people. And it's not just stress, not just tension. They can get pretty upset if they see that they are not advancing as quickly as others. So for instance, in the rat race, if they're being overtaken by someone else, that can be the cause of emotional upset. Now, the Tao, of course, is about skillful living, just like it is in our previous discussions about choosing the right perspective in terms of comparing higher, comparing lower. Here too, the Tao can help us pick and choose the better perspective, one that is more empowering to us. And this applies to various aspects of life. So the Tao itself is all about the Great Circle. And when we look at the concept of ahead and behind in the Great Circle, we find that the concept has a lot to say. In every level of existence, the Tao shows up as a Great Circle. This includes the existence of human beings. It includes the rat race we were just talking about. The Great Circle, it must be noted, has no beginning or end. It's a circle. Every point on the Great Circle is both the beginning and the end. It is neither, it is both. There is no ahead or behind in this Great Circle. That is, someone who appears to be just ahead of you can also be seen as being greatly behind, that you have lapped that person. Now, this is not a new concept, it's very old. It pre-existed before the time of Lao Tzu. Zhuangzi, the storytelling sage, came after Lao Tzu by several hundred years, so definitely the concept predated him as well. He learned the concept about the Great Circle as it applied to myriad things. The myriad things are the living things in this world, and it includes all of us. So, commenting on that, Zhuangzi wrote a line that I would like to translate for you. So there's the Chinese, but let me go directly to the translation. Zhuangzi wrote, they, the myriad things, begin and end like a ring. One cannot comprehend their order. This is called the heavenly wheel. So I need to explain exactly what that means. Let me focus on the meaning. This is the Tao methodology or the style of using the same idea that we frequently encounter as well. In modern times, we often hear the question, which came before, the chicken or the egg? That is because we know the chicken comes from the egg comes from the chicken, and so on. That's why both Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi noted this ring-like progression in the cycles governing life. That's why Zhuangzi wrote, they begin and end like a ring, and one cannot comprehend their order. Which came first? This is called the heavenly wheel. Let me explain. When I say wheel, it is tempting to think of a wheel like a carriage. That's actually not what the character is. The character, the very last character that you see there, Jun, it is actually the ancient character for the potter's wheel. The potter's wheel is the horizontal circular spinning wheel. You mount clay pottery on top of it. Then, as the wheel is spinning in circular fashion, you shape it into a container, a pottery object. That is the wheel, the potter's wheel. So the cycles exhibited by life, life begetting life, is like a wheel, and it's shaping living things like the pottery that is being shaped by the hands of the potter. So put that visual in your mind and think of living things, including ourselves, as being like a piece of pottery that is being formed on the spinning pottery wheel. And you get the exact metaphor that Zhuangzi is trying to convey. There again, the great circle, circular motion, the ring, the unbroken ring. So that is how the great circle can manifest. Let's look at it in a slightly different way. The complements. I talked about the complements and comparisons, and I can divide up the circle into pieces, and I can bring in the complements. You can see there that being is opposite to non-being. Difficult is the complement to easy. Long versus short. Music versus voice. That is the visual for what we're talking about today. We can form some conclusions about that. First, everything makes sense in comparison with its complements. We have seen how that is true with the many different comparisons we have already looked at. Next, nothing is absolutely good or bad in itself. Everything is relative. Is it good to have something that's easy? Not necessarily. Is it good or bad to have something that's difficult? Well, people may think, well, difficult is bad. And yet, difficult is a necessary ingredient in life. In that sense, it is good. It is a challenge we can overcome. It's a victory that we can rightfully earn. In that context, it's actually very good. It can be both good or bad. It's just a matter of comparison. And when you look at these comparisons, it's like the two sides of a coin. The existence of one side guarantees the existence of the other. When you're looking at one side of a coin, you know there's a flip side, even if you can't see it at the moment. And lastly, anything can be one or the other, depending on situational context. Something can be hard in comparison with something else, but then easy compared to yet another thing, just like long and short. Continue on, let's talk about the next important concept, which is 圣人, the sage or sages. The pinyin is easy, 圣人, and then the meaning is divine. 圣 means divine, 人 means person. When you put divine and person together, you get a person with divine wisdom, a sage. The person with divinely inspired wisdom, or you can say divinely wise person. I want to go over this with you because this is important as a preview for our next discussion. Shen Ren here is the first appearance of the central concept in the Tao. So we're going to talk about this a lot more. For now, I just want you to know that 圣人 appears 31 times total throughout the Tao Te Ching. This is an indication of its importance. Something gets repeated that much, you and I want to understand it more. So next time, we'll return to this particular slide as the launching point for a full-on discussion about 圣人 and the way that 圣人act in the world. Very important. For now, though, we are approaching the end of our time together today, so I can see that I need to jump ahead to the summary. So let me summarize what we have talked about so far. What we have done is that we've gone through complementary dualities, and most often we use the yin and yang symbol to demonstrate or show the dualities. We understand the world through them. When we talk about beauty, ugliness, that's attractive, unattractive, we talk about good and bad, kindness, cruelty, kindness, malice. We understand the world through the comparisons and the complements. Then, the measurements, they have meaning relative to one another, and we talked about long and short, high and low, and we talked about other related quantifiable measurements as well. Number 3, out of all these complementary dualities, you and I can pick and choose the perspective that is empowering. So, abundance or lack, ahead or behind. This goes back to our discussion in regards to looking at the people who have more and the people who have less. In comparison to them, how should we feel about that? Well, we can pick and choose our perspective to put us on the right path for Tao cultivation. So much more to talk about in this chapter. Although it is only the second chapter in the Tao Te Ching, it is incredibly profound, and I think everyone will really appreciate, especially when we talk about central concepts like the sage and the concept of Wu Wei. Our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Until next time, may the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.